I think we have time for questions if anyone has any.
Do you feel at all encouraged by the midterm elections?
The question is whether I feel encouraged by the midterm elections. Certainly it's encouraging. For me, the engine of the movement is personal and economic despair. And that's the engine of all totalitarian movements. That's not an original thought. Fritz Stern wrote about this in The Politics of Cultural Despair. Hannah Arendt wrote about this in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Karl Popper understood this. And what we have done over the last few decades is disenfranchise tens of millions of people in this country. There's been a Weimarization of the American working class, many of whom come from my own family, where they can no longer get jobs which can sustain them in a dignified and meaningful way. And you go to some of the former manufacturing centers, as I have over the last 2 years, in places like Ohio, and the end of the world is no longer an abstraction to these people. And the disintegration of community has brought with it the social ills, the disintegration of family, addictions, domestic abuse, schools that no longer function, coupled, of course, with a removal of any kind of credible or meaningful federal assistance. And I blame much of that on the Clinton administration. And we are left in a situation where there is no check on the creation of a rapacious American oligarchy. We now live in a country where the top 1% of this nation controls more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. And when you create those kind of economic dislocations, when you shunt these people aside, and they're largely invisible now in press that is controlled by these corporations, the result is political deformation, political distortions, which is exactly what the Christian right is. Because what the Christian right does is it removes them from a reality-based world. It gives them a non-reality-based belief system. That gives them a belief system in magic, where Jesus intervenes on a daily basis in their life, where God has a plan for them, where they are protected, supported. And once you remove, and we're talking about tens of millions of people in this country, once you remove this number of people from a reality-based world, and that, of course, is what creationism is about. It's not about an alternative. It is about the destruction of science. Facts become interchangeable with opinions. Lies become true. Facts that are inconvenient are simply discarded and ignored. And that, of course, is the very definition, as George Orwell understood, of how a totalitarian society works. And the first thing totalitarian movements do is they remove their believers, from the reality-based world by conjuring up a lying world of consistency until they have the power to shut those iron gates and impose that world on the rest of us. And there is no hope to blunting this movement until we step in and re-enfranchise these people back into the society. This is a movement built on profound despair. And it is a despair, unfortunately, we as citizens have sat by complacently and allowed to happen.
The Pat Robertsons of the world quite obviously got a vehement attitude toward Islam. So do you think that those sentiments are fueled by ideological differences, or do you think it's political?
Well, the question is about the attitudes of people like Pat Robertson to Islam. Well, there's a frightening demonization of everybody who's outside the movement, including people of other faiths. It's a binary worldview, black and white, good and evil. And all of those who do not submit to this movement. And this is, of course, when you look closely at the type of power structure that they impose on their followers, one sees, I think, clearly on the micro level, the authoritarian or despotic quality of the movement. In the family unit, the male is the undisputed head of the household. The woman is subservient. I mean, people like James Dobson not only call on women to remove themselves from the workforce and stay at home, but to remove the children from the public schools, and the role of the women is to essentially be part of this indoctrinating process through Christian homeschooling, which is, of the, I think, 1.1 million people homeschooled in this country, I forget the exact figure, most of them are being filled with this frightening mythological vision of science, American history, and everything else. So there's a demonization of everyone outside the movement, not just Muslims. But of course, Muslims become, especially since Armageddon will supposedly take place in the Middle East, a wonderful kind of foil. And I think that what you see with leaders like this is a redirecting of that rage and that yearning for violence, especially apocalyptic violence, which they believe will be a kind of cleansing of the society, a redirecting of that rage, giving people a moral license to hate and even kill those who oppose them. And that's certainly what we're seeing in the Middle East. And in all apocalyptic movements, which essentially is what this movement is, play off apocalyptic elements on the other side. So that, and of course in many ways they mirror each other. So that you find Islamic radicals in many ways mirroring Christian radicals. And I watched this, in places like the Balkans. And what they do within their own societies is essentially destroy the center, destroy the moderate base within their own society, so that it becomes so polarized. And just as Franjo Tuđman, the dictator in Croatia, needed Slobodan Milosevic, who ran the Serbian nationalist movement out of Serbia, Milosevic needed Tuđman. You need people with a similar binary worldview, a similar penchant for violence, to play off of each other and destroy the centers within your own societies. That is happening in the Muslim world, but it's also happening here in the United States.
How do you see the Bush administration relating to the religious right movement?
Well, the religious right has gained tremendous inroads in the Bush administration, inroads that they never had before. There's been a hijacking of government scientific, of reproductive rights programs, AIDS research. They've, of course, received, as I mentioned, hundreds of millions of dollars. Very hard. People have tried to pin down the exact figure. It's very hard to pin it down. But certainly, taxpayers' money is being given to Pat Robertson's Operation Blessing. I mean, these people are getting big money. And certainly there has been, at least up until the midterm elections, an attempt to politicize the judiciary by putting in ideologically driven judges. We see it within the military. We see there's a huge push by the radical Christian right to take over the chaplaincies. And this isn't a matter of presenting a particular religious viewpoint. It's about indoctrination. It's ultimately about the politicizing the military itself. So that, and if you go and look, if you can find it, because it got yanked off their website and they made YouTube take it down, but the Christian Embassy put out a video after 9/11 where they went to the Pentagon, they interviewed senior officials, colonels, generals in the military, talking about their commitment to Christ, talking about the proselytizing efforts within the military. And that, coupled with these mercenary groups that they have created in Iraq, 25,000 mercenaries, groups like Blackwater, run by Eric Prince, a very secretive, multimillionaire figure very close to the Christian right. What we're seeing is the effort to build a kind of Praetorian Guard. And I think, for me, one of the most chilling moments in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina is when these Blackwater operatives in their black uniforms and wraparound sunglasses and big SUVs and automatic weapons appeared on the streets of New Orleans. In a moment of crisis, the ability to deploy mercenaries who are outside the legal structure on the streets of our cities brings us dangerously close to the collapse of the democratic state. Now, none of these movements, no totalitarian movement, is going to come to power unless there is a period of prolonged instability. And we don't have that now. But should we have it? I spent a year of my life covering Al-Qaeda for the New York Times. And there was not an intelligence official I interviewed here or in Europe who didn't speak about another catastrophic terrorist attack on American soil as an inevitability. Should that moment occur, should there be an economic collapse, should there be a series of environmental disasters, then what's to prevent these Blackwater operatives from appearing on the streets of Washington? And that's the old question which destroyed what was left of the Roman Republic, is who guards the guards?
I'd just be curious to know what inspired you to write the book and to take up this subject.
Anger. I come out of the church. My father, who was probably the greatest influence on my life, a Presbyterian pastor in upstate New York, had combined that deep moral probity, no alcohol in the manse where I grew up. I never heard my father swear. We didn't work on Sunday. But with a commitment to social justice, which, like Adams, he believed was an integral part of the biblical message, so that he was involved in the civil rights movement. I think many people forget that in rural white enclaves, such as the one I grew up in the early 1960s, Martin Luther King was one of the most hated men in America. And then went on to work in the anti-war movement. I remember when I was about 12 or 13, he told me that if the war was still going on when I was 18 and I was drafted, he would go to prison with me. And I still carry this image of sitting in a jail cell with my dad. And he died in 1995, but the last years of his life were spent in the gay rights movement. His youngest brother, my uncle, was gay, so he had a real sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and 60s. I went to Colgate University. There was no gay and lesbian organization. And when my father, by this time he had a church in Syracuse, found this out, it was about an hour away, he brought the gay speakers to my campus. This was in the 1970s. And this led to students confiding in my father after several of these visits that they were too uncomfortable coming out of the closet and founding a gay and lesbian organization on the campus. And so this was a problem my dad solved by taking me to lunch and telling me, although I wasn't gay, that I had to found it. So I used to walk into the dining hall, and the guy would take my card for breakfast, lunch, or dinner and check it off and hand it back to me and go, faggot. So I made it my undergraduate mission to seduce his girlfriend.
I saw your piece in Salon, which I liked, but it occurs to me it must be a pretty tough sell to get media bookings for this, for this book tour. Are you meeting a lot of resistance, or what's coming up?
No, I'm getting bookings. I've just started. But I think one of the things that surprised me is why I'm not challenged more on the use of the word fascism. I mean, it's a loaded term. I think generically the movement fits. I think when you read people like Paxton, I begin the book, for those of you who have a copy, with Umberto Eco's 14 qualities that make a blue shirt or black shirt, whatever the Italian fascists wore. Paxton, I think, writes correctly, and this is in his book Anatomy of Fascism, that all societies carry within them movements that essentially can be defined as fascist. He said that in our past, the Ku Klux Klan was probably the most authentically fascist movement created within American society. So I think they fit. I mean, I think that when you look at the cult of masculinity, the war against intellectualism, the obsession with violence as a way to cleanse the world, there are enough qualities within the movement to generically call it. But it's a loaded word. It brings up historical connotations. These fascist movements adopt indigenous symbols and language, which is something, there's a great book, A Shall Bear Witness, by Victor Klemperer, who was a professor of Romance languages, I believe in Leipzig, Jewish, and lost his post, and did sort of the first literary critique of the Nazi Party or National Socialism. And he understood how these movements hollow out words so that they use a comforting kind of vocabulary. They use symbols that make us feel as if there's a kind of continuity But they turn these symbols and this language to mean often things that are diametrically opposed to what the words have meant in the past. I mean, Orwell gets this with this kind of, peace is war kind of thing. You see it in the word liberty. If you notice that President Bush, after he gave his nationwide address calling for the escalation of troop numbers in Iraq, he didn't end by saying God bless America. He ended by talking about that force which gives us liberty. I forget the exact phrase. That liberty is an extremely loaded word, because liberty for people in the movement means the liberty that comes by giving your life over to and submitting completely to Jesus Christ. It means it's liberty as submission. So that when we hear the word liberty, it still continues to mean what we think it has always meant. But to the radical base, it's a message. And it's not a message, and Bush has an evangelical speechwriter. It's a message. They constantly send out this stream of coded messages. And I think when you read Klemperer or Orwell, you understand very well that corruption of language, that poisoning of the civil discourse, which always presages the rise of totalitarian movements.
No, there have been arguments that members of the Christian right are voting against their economic interests. How do they define their economic interests?
Yeah, that's Thomas Frank's argument. I don't think these people come from, by the time they're wrapped in the embrace of this movement, by the time they spend all day long sitting in front of Sky Angel or TBN or the 700 Club, they have already been removed from the reality-based world. I attended a seminar for the book in, I think it was either Missouri or Kansas, but it was a seminar for teachers in Christian schools, and it was instructing them on how to teach the process of creation. Now, you only need to read the book of Genesis once to understand that the writers of the book of Genesis thought the earth was flat. They not only thought the earth was flat, they thought there were rivers above and below us. In the creation story, God creates light on the first day and the sun on the fourth day. So this creates, obviously, the obvious question, what happened for the 4 days? And according to the instructor, God created a temporary light. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that even hints that God created a temporary light for that 4-day period. But I think it's in those kinds of details that you find how desperate these people are to hang on to this magical belief system, which is what it is. The writers of the book of Genesis knew nothing about the process of creation. That's not why they wrote the book of Genesis. They were writing about the purpose of creation. And that is something that I believe they did know a lot about. It's why the Bible, for me, is worth reading. But when people live in a non-reality-based world, when they believe that dinosaurs existed with Adam and Eve, I was at the $25 million Creation Museum in Kentucky, which I think is opening in a couple weeks. And, they have a replica of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are naked, but they're turned in such a way that you can't see breasts or anything. And they have dinosaurs there, and visitors are explained that in the Garden of Eden, dinosaurs were safe because they only ate plants, including T-Rex, and the reason he had long teeth is so he could open coconuts. This is all real. And that it was only after the fall that dinosaurs became meat eaters. There was a replica of Noah's Ark, and of course that thorny question of how you fit dinosaurs on an ark. And that was solved because Noah only put baby dinosaurs on the ark. I mean, when you get down to that kind of level, you realize the absolute absurdity of the belief system. But while it's absurd, that's all these people have. And part of the rage that they feel towards critics comes from this fear of being pushed back in the reality-based world in which they could not cope, the world that betrayed them, the world that they yearn to be destroyed. And that's essentially what this obsession with apocalyptic violence is. It is about destroying the world that betrayed them, along with all of the people who betrayed them.
How many people do you think are just fellow travelers on this versus real hard believers? I must say in my own family we range from hard believers to let's get along at Thanksgiving dinner to me.
Right. Well, all radical movements we know from writers like Crane Britton in his great book Anatomy of a Revolution are tiny. That hardcore, ruthless, manipulative, the James Dobsons of the world. I mean, single percentage numbers. It's small. I mean, what were the Bolsheviks? 1%? But they count on the sympathy of 80 to 100 million people who define themselves as evangelicals. And I think what's so fascinating for me about this movement is that these people are not fundamentalists, and they're not evangelicals. I mean, fundamentalists have always called on followers to remove them, traditionally, to remove themselves from the contaminants of secular society, to shun politics because it's dirty. Traditional evangelical leaders like Billy Graham always called on their followers to be wary of political power. Graham himself was badly burned by Nixon. This is a new animal. We have not seen this before. We continue, and of course, they propagate those terms. We continue to use terms like fundamentalist to describe someone like Jerry Falwell. He's not a fundamentalist. Pat Robertson is not an evangelical. What we're seeing is a mutation, something radically different. We're seeing, in proper terms, dominionists, people who believe that they have been given they have a God-given right to run this country and ultimately to run the globe. And that's a huge. There's a huge chasm between these people and what we've seen in American society in the past.
Make this our last question of the evening.
I mean, given what you were describing of the determination of the Christian right, the Dobsons, the Robertsons, the Falwells to impose their belief system on the society in terms of running the government, and the fact that they have been, packing the federal judiciary, they're the hundreds of millions of dollars you're talking about, the fact they're in the White House. I mean, it seems to me that they're fairly far along on this path. We're not in a theocracy, but they're fairly far along, given, along with the things like the Military Commissions Act, the legalization of torture and holding people, I mean, all these different measures they've taken. And then you pose the question of what would happen if there was some other 9/11 incident or some other kind of catastrophe. And the question I wanted to pose is, based on your study of this whole movement and where you see this going, to me it doesn't seem like we have a whole lot of time. So from your viewpoint, what do you see doing now to stop this?
Well, the question is, how much time do we have? How far along is this movement? What worries me, I think that we're in a situation that's somewhat similar to the 1930s, where again we had a period where many, many people in this society had essentially been pushed out of mainstream society. There were powerful progressive forces within the press, which of course had a kind of multiplicity that it no longer has. I think it's, if I'm correct, 80% of America's newspapers are controlled by 6 or 8 corporations. Broadcast journalism virtually doesn't exist anymore, with the exception of C-SPAN and a few other, NPR, but there's not much out there. I worry that we don't have the power, organized power, in the event of a crisis to stand up against them. That there may be a kind of individual reaction. I don't think most Americans, I don't think even most evangelicals want to live in the kind of America these people want to create. But of course, by the time they find out, it will be too late. And one has to look at the transformation of any society at a moment of radical change. Iran would be a good example. When Ayatollah Khomeini came back, secular Iranians were cheering him in the street. The notion in 1979 that Iranian women would be forced to cover their heads was laughable. But there is a slow, gradual, almost imperceptible erosion that totalitarian movements make. The Nazis did it. It took them a very long time. Claudia Kuntz's book, The Nazi Conscience is a great read, or Sebastian Hoffner's Define Hitler, you understand that this is a long process. And by the time people wake up, it's too late. That process is clearly underway, without question. And Hoffner writes after the burning of the Reichstag and Hitler's declaring of martial law, how I think hundreds of thousands of Germans poured out into the street in protest, but there was no leadership. The opposition was bankrupt. In fact, the Social Democrats fled to a villa they had rented in Lugano in Switzerland. And without that opposition, without the ability of leaders to stand up, even the majority who opposes this move is essentially rendered impotent. And I fear that we keep moving down this path. And I don't find very many people standing up and ringing the kind of alarm bells. Certainly very few within the Democratic Party, which should be our opposition. Well, Webb is. I think Webb gets it, at least from my point of view. I mean, I think Webb gets how dangerous this economic dislocation and the creation of an American oligarchy is to our democratic system. And that's not a new thought. I mean, Plutarch wrote about this. He said that disparity between the rich and the poor is the worst ailment that can beset any republic. Thucydides understood it. When Athens' empire expanded and many of the neighboring Greek states did not want to live under Athenian control, and Athens had to impose greater and greater tyranny, Thucydides wrote, "The tyranny we impose on others, we will eventually impose on ourselves." Which is, of course, what happened. It was the death of Athenian democracy. And I think when we look carefully at how we deal now with the rest of the world, we as a country are essentially capable of only speaking to people outside our gates in the language of violence. This language of violence is going to be brought home, already is being brought home. Look at our prison system. So that I having spent 2 decades of my life outside the United States, the disparity between what I left and what I came back to is stark and frightening. Thank you very much.